Hello everybody, it's Miss Miller here. I hope you're well. I hope you've been enjoying Paddington as much as I have. I'm here today to read you chapter 5. Paddington soon settled down and became one of the family. In fact, in no time at all, it was difficult to imagine what life had been like without him. He made himself useful around the house and the days passed quickly. The Browns lived near Portobello Road, where there was a big market, and quite often, when Mrs. Brown was busy, she would let him go out and do the shopping for her. Mr. Brown had made a shopping trolley for him, an old basket on wheels with a handle for steering it. Paddington was a good shopper and soon became well known to all the traders in the market. He was very thorough and took the job of shopping very seriously. He would press the fruit to make sure that it had the right degree of firmness, as Mrs. Bird had shown him, and he was always on the lookout for bargains. He was a popular bear with the traders, and most of them went out of their way to save the best things of the day for him. "That bear gets more for his 10p than anybody I know," said Mrs. Bird. "I don't know how he gets away with it. I really don't. It must be that mean streak in him." "I'm not mean," said Paddington. "I'm just careful, that's all." "Whatever it is," replied Mrs. Bird, "you're worth your weight in gold." Paddington took this remark very seriously and spent a long time weighing himself on the bathroom scales. Eventually, he decided to consult his friend Mr. Gruber on the subject. Now, Paddington spent a lot of his time looking in shop windows, and of all the windows in Portobello Road, Mr. Gruber's was the best. For one thing, it was nice and low, so he could look in it without having to stand on his tiptoes. And for another, it was full of lots of interesting things. Old pieces of furniture, medals, pots and pans, pictures. There were so many things, it was sometimes difficult to get inside. And Mr. Gruber spent a lot of his time sitting on a deck chair on the pavement. Mr. Gruber, in turn, found Paddington very interesting, and soon they became great friends. Paddington stopped there on his way home from a shopping expedition, and they spent many hours discussing South America, where Mr. Gruber had been when he was a boy. Mr. Gruber usually had a bun and a cup of cocoa in the morning for what he called his elevenses, and he had taken to sharing it with Paddington. "There's nothing like a nice chat over a bun and a cup of cocoa," he said. And Paddington, who liked all three, agreed with him, even though the cocoa did make his whiskers go a funny colour. Paddington was always interested in bright things, and he had consulted Mr. Gruber one morning on the subject of his Peruvian centavos. He had an idea in the back of his mind that if they were worth a lot of money, he could perhaps sell them and buy a present for the Browns. The £1 a week pocket money Mr. Brown gave him was nice, but by the time he had bought buns on a Saturday morning, there wasn't much left. After a great deal of consideration, Mr. Gruber had advised Paddington to keep the coins. "It's not always the brightest things that fetch the most money, Mr. Brown," he had said. Mr. Gruber always called Paddington Mr. Brown, and it made him feel very important. He had taken Paddington to the back of the shop, where his desk was, and from a drawer he had taken a cardboard box full of old coins. They were rather dirty and disappointing. "See these, Mr. Brown," he had said. "These are what they called sovereigns. You wouldn't think that they were very valuable when you look at them, but they are. They are made of gold, and they're worth £50 each. That's more than £100 for an ounce. If you ever find one of those, you bring them to me." One day, having weighed himself carefully on the scales, Paddington hurried around to see Mr. Gruber, taking with him a piece of paper from his scrapbook, covered in mysterious calculations. After a big meal on Sunday, Paddington had discovered he weighed nearly £16. That was, he looked at his piece of paper again, as he neared Mr. Gruber's shop, that was nearly 260 ounces, which meant he was worth nearly £26,000. Mr. Gruber listened carefully to all that Paddington had to tell him, and he closed his eyes and he thought for a minute. He was a kind man, and he didn't want to disappoint Paddington. I have no doubt, he said at last, that you are special. You are obviously a very valuable young bear. I know it. Mr. and Mrs. Brown knows it. Mrs. Bird knows it. But do other people? He looked at Paddington over his glasses. Things aren't always what they seem in this world, Mr. Brown, he said sadly. Paddington sighed. That's very disappointing. I wish they were. It would be nice. Perhaps, said Mr. Gruber mysteriously. Perhaps. But we shouldn't have any nice surprises then, would we? He took Paddington into his shop and, after offering him a seat, disappeared for a minute. When he returned, he was carrying a large picture of a boat. At least half of it was a boat. The other half seemed to be a picture of a lady in a large hat. There you are, he said proudly. That's what I mean by things aren't always what they seem. I'd like your opinion on it, Mr. Brown. Paddington felt rather flattered, but also puzzled. The picture didn't seem to be one thing or another, and he said so. Ah, said Mr. Gruber delightedly. It isn't at the moment, but just you wait until I've cleaned it. I gave 50p for that picture years ago, when it was just a picture of a sailing ship. And what do you think? When I started to clean it the other day, all the paint began to come off, and I discovered there was another painting underneath. He looked around and lowered his voice. Nobody else knows, he whispered, but I think the one underneath may be valuable. It may be what they call an old master. Seeing that Paddington still looked confused, he explained to him that in the old days, when artists ran short of money and they couldn't afford any more canvases to paint on, they sometimes painted on top of old pictures, and sometimes, very occasionally, they painted on top of pictures by artists who afterwards became famous and whose pictures were worth lots of money. But as they had been painted over, nobody knew anything about them. All sounds very complicated, said Paddington. Mr. Gruber talked for a long time about painting, which was one of his favourite subjects, but Paddington thought he was usually interested in anything Mr. Gruber had to say, but he wasn't listening. Eventually, refusing Mr. Gruber's offer for a second cup of cocoa, he slipped down off the chair and began making his way home. He raised his hat automatically whenever anybody said good day to him, but there was a far-away expression in his eyes. Even the smells of buns from the bakery passed unheeded. Paddington had an idea. When he got home, he went upstairs to his room and lay on the bed for a long time, while staring up at the ceiling. He was there so long that Mrs. Bird became quite worried, and she poked her head around the door to know if he was okay. I'm quite all right, thank you, said Paddington distantly. I'm just thinking. Miss Bird closed the door and hurried downstairs to tell the others. Her news had a mixed reception. I don't mind him just thinking, said Mrs. Brown, with a worried expression on her face. It's when he actually thinks of something. That's when the trouble starts. But she was in the middle of housework and soon forgot the matter. Certainly, both she and Mrs. Bird were much too busy to notice the small figure of a bear creeping cautiously in the direction of Mr. Brown's shed. A few minutes later. Nor did they see him when he returned with a bottle of Mrs. Brown's paint remover and a large pile of rags. Had they have done so, they might have had good cause to worry. And if Mrs. Brown had seen him creeping on his tiptoes into the drawing room, closing the door carefully behind him, she wouldn't have had a minute's peace. Fortunately, everybody was much too busy to notice any of these things. Even more fortunately, no one came into the drawing room for quite a while, because Paddington was in a mess. Things hadn't gone according to plan. He was beginning to wish he had listened more carefully to the things Mr. Gruber had said on the subject of cleaning paintings. Oh no, I wonder what Paddington's done. Has he made a mess? Has he ruined a painting? Have to wait and see tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Stay safe. See you. Bye.